start with a bit of a landmark statistic. And it's probably a number that you're probably already aware of and everyone's already seen before, which is GenAI is disrupting the way that enterprises solve problems across every single industry vertical that we have today. And actually, the thing that I think is a really strong point to take away from today's webinar is actually 80% of enterprises will either have a model or an API in production environments by 2026. And that's not too far away. That's a large fundamental change in adoption for technology. That's probably a faster adoption than what we saw with mobile apps and mobile local. It's probably a similar rate of change to what we saw with blockchain, if not faster. And this unprecedented pace is being matched at the same time as us being actually challenged around this new battleground where data analytics and big data suddenly looks like a GenAI problem-solving set. And this is what enterprises are very much so hooking onto to be able to drive forward. If we dig into that a little bit in this number, which I think is particularly interesting, is when we review the last year's GenAI project statistics, and this comes from one of our partners, Gartner, it's actually 46% of last year's enterprise GenAI proof of concepts made it into production. And actually, the majority of those stayed in development or stayed in proof of concept stage and never really got realized for business value. And this is a challenge across the organizations that we talk to and across the businesses that we interface with, which actually, whilst you've got record numbers on GenAI adoption, you're seeing growing concern on high project failure rates. And questions we get asked time and time again is, what can Civo do to be able to help that? And when we look at the numbers that are driving these high project failure rates, is actually the largest one is a lack of GenAI ready infrastructure surrounding that API and surrounding that model. And we think this is really important for customers to understand, is that actually the majority of the bottlenecks and challenges you have will be existing issues with your cloud platform or existing on-premise infrastructure. And being a GenAI ready cloud is actually something that requires being relatively recent. And the question we have here is actually, do you have the data infrastructure to be able to process your high performance computing? Is that necessary?
Josh, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt and just ask. I mean, is that because like hosting a large language model yourself is just complicated? It's hard to stand up. It's hard to life cycle. It's hard to, I mean, you've been doing this for us, so you know that it's challenging, but is that why people are struggling with it so much? Is it's like, it's a different kind of workload and they just haven't done it before?
I think it's a evolution of existing high performance computing. And actually, some of these concepts we've seen existingly have just been scaled and stretched further. And some of these things, like having the latest next generation highest performance model, might unlock some AI challenges. But if you're still using your old school 1990s database to be able to power that, that's going to cause bottlenecks downstream. And I think, to add to that point as well, Kendall, is, is the data in that database ready for AI? Is it annotated? Do you have your experts labeling it? Is it in a state where it's clean and ready to use? And I think a lot of those things are becoming really interesting and driving the kind of question is your cloud AI ready? Or is your cloud built to be AI ready 5-6 years ago? And these recent developments have taken it by surprise.
Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. I see it as an evolution. I also think there's just enough things different about it that people really struggle with it. And I think that the clean data thing is a really interesting point. But sorry, I interrupted. Keep going.
No, please always do. But I think that's a really good point as well, Kendall, is it's the most intimidating it's ever been to run a GenAI product. But actually, it's the closest it's ever been to our fingertips. And there's more opportunities, more managed services, more consumers knowing and understanding AI and ML, which I think is fascinating. And if you jump to the use cases that I think are driving this, we shouldn't be afraid to say things that some of these solutions 5 years ago would feel like science fiction. And actually, some of these solutions have never been achievable before until GenAI enabled it. And to start on the left-hand side to a discipline close to my heart is actually in pharmaceuticals and larger material sciences, we're seeing 30% of new drugs and materials being systematically discovered by GenAI. And there's some evidence for this on the Civo platform today with customers like Orbital Materials, who are using AI models to do things like decarbonize data centers and actually reduce the carbon footprint of the workloads that they run. And then looking across to marketing, a very different discipline, we're looking at by 2025, 30% of all outbound marketing messages being synthetically generated. So we're in the era where you can receive an email and you're asking yourself the question, was this written by a human or a machine? And I think as that continues to grow and as we continue to expand into marketing, there's so many different considerations to think about there besides the model. And then my favorite one towards the end here is actually by 2030, a major blockbuster film will be released with 90% of that content generated by AI. And these are fundamental paradigm changes. And actually, if you look at these, there's three really good examples of very privacy and security-based data. If it's pharmaceuticals, being very IP focused. If it's marketing, it's being the leads and people you want to sell your product to. And in film and media, it's literally your creative design. And we think that there's a couple of considerations here that are really important. But actually, when we talk to customers at Civo, the thing that we think holds back these use cases being able to grow and scale is actually the privacy and security. And on the next slide here, we dig a little bit into it. And some of these are examples I'd really advise everyone to read into. But if I start on the privacy section, and I think that's actually a really good use case here, is that inputs into LLMs are often used for training. And actually, you would always want to check with your LLM provider about making sure that the information you input into this will always be accessible and usable. And actually, there's an Italian court case here for misuse of private information, both in the training data. There's also use cases in pharmaceuticals where you'll see people who are wondering how intellectual property that they put into AI tools is ending up being in their competitors' hands. And looking at compliance, we're seeing actually large degrees of challenges around companies like OpenAI being able to prove their accuracy behind some of these disciplines like medicine. And whilst we think that still is a progress and a research effort worth making, is actually the comebacks for using those in production with things like medical patients is the recommendation that OpenAI will pay your legal bills. Not promise you won't get sued for using people's private information in your system. And we obviously are very much so closely following the EU data privacy in this area, and making sure we have clear visibility about how these things move forward. And then in security, I think what takes most people by surprise is actually websites like ChatGPT have had significant data breaches. And actually, I believe it was 2024, 12% of all premium subscribers' information was leaked publicly. And if you're included in that 12%, you can go find your conversations that you had with ChatGPT in torrents and on the dark web. And I think it's particularly interesting with parameters and being able to put perimeters around your data. When you've got these types of really private pieces of information that you're using in the business every single day, being able to rely on the ownership of your data inside that, we think is really critical to what you're doing.
So it's and I'm going to say back to you, Josh, and correct me if I get this wrong. There's this quote, right? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic, right? Which I think that LLMs and modern AI has felt that way. It's felt magical. I can go have a conversation, have anything answered. So these questions that I've been embarrassed to ever ask publicly, I can go ask ChatGPT because no one will know, and then that gets leaked. Or, this business process that I want feedback on, and LLMs are really good at giving feedback on a business process document. All of a sudden I get all this feedback. Turns out maybe that's leaked to my competitors. So there's lots of it is magical in some ways that, it feels wild and new and crazy, and that's why people go and use it. But there's costs is what you're getting to, especially with these big public companies. And it feels like it's going to be safe, secure, and trustworthy. And it's so new and we're moving so fast, we're afraid to miss out. But actually there's cost and there's risk is what you're saying. Man, if only there was somebody offering a really private solution that we could leverage that hopefully we'll talk about here very shortly.
Absolutely. And I think, just to add to that, I think the world of AI is so complex. We have so many consumers using it. So as operators and people who run services in AI, we have a responsibility to make sure these things are private, secure, compliant. We move on to the next slide, because actually I think alongside this, we're talking about mass consumer adoption of AI. And actually, there's a really important piece here around non-technical users. I think to the thing we mentioned before, Kendall, about AI being at everyone's fingertips right now. Actually, the majority of organizations we talk to don't have any internal policy, training, or guidelines about how companies or employees should be using GenAI. And that itself takes a huge step towards prevention. But we also think is really important in the same way that in early days of web applications, we gave people viewpoints on making sure their passwords were secure and to standards. And actually, I think this conversation we're having now is people are starting to understand, much like other ML AI solutions, as the data in increases the quality of the output you get out. Actually, good data in will always give you good data out. And as you grow to use AI processes, over time you'll realize that good data you need to put in is your private data. The public data that's already been training this model doesn't need that. And I think making sure people understand the value of the data they're in when they're inputting that into an LLM is really important. If you're using a medical record or a patient lead, you'd be very clear in saying this is private. I think everyone taking a mindset, and that's everyone, regardless of level of technical expertise, about keeping cybersecurity and confidential information safe is really important. And we advise that actually, if customers need any help putting those policies together, we have guidelines and templates that companies can use to accelerate their GenAI adoption. Let's talk about what we do differently. And actually, I think I've spent a long time talking about the landscape and the challenges of GenAI. But what we've done on the next slide is actually put together a number of very different components that we think massively reduce the complexity of being able to build high-performance computing systems.
Well, and Josh, before you dive into this, can I add one other thing too? To the lack of AI policy and training, I have a good friend who works at a large enterprise where they have decided that no one, like the policy is you cannot use LLMs or AI of any kind anywhere ever. And what he sees happen is because they've gone with that policy, what people do is they pull out their phones and they use it on the side, and they're using it with company data, and they're using it even worse because that policy has gone so strict. So there's a million ways to do it wrong, right up to and including no, under no circumstances can you use it, because it doesn't lead to nobody using it. And so you do need to have a solution that does actually work. And sorry, so please get back to our solution and how wonderful it is, because I'm pleased with it too.
No, but I think you got a really good point, which is, ChatGPT, Claude, some of the fastest adopted technologies, the most installed apps in the App Store. You can't have a prohibitionary approach to this. You need to have a security first and security by default mindset, which is what we think is really important. And actually being privacy by design and secure by default, I think leads really well into actually how we position our products differently. And actually, instead of having 150 managed services, we actually have a number of fundamental baseline bedrock services that we think provide a wider degree of functionality than just solving machine learning models. And actually, the pieces that we think are really fundamentally important to that is actually our compute instances product, which provides an equivalent to something like an Amazon EC2. Gives you Kubernetes managed and Kubernetes backed compute and volumes, and just removes the complexity of being able to provision complex machine learning workloads by having all of those provided by default. And the same thing for our managed Kubernetes, to take the complexity out of Kubernetes and worry about orchestrating high performance infrastructure. We will provide that out of the box with the latest NVIDIA GPUs. And then on the right, what we do very differently with data is we obviously support the wide remit of paradigms between volumes, databases, and object stores, but actually all of our data egress and all of our data ingress costs are included by default. And that allows you to think very differently about how you design your solutions, particularly in regards to performance.
I want to highlight that point, because I feel like people miss that, and I feel like it's a really key selling point. Data ingress and egress are included. It's not an additional fee. That's a big deal. It shouldn't be a big deal. It's just that compared to the other guys, it is. Keep going.
I always think that's something that if you've gone viral on the internet, or if you had like 1,000 people land on your website in a day, you'll completely understand as a benefit. Because if you've ever gone viral on Reddit and you suddenly had thousands of people jump on your app, you realize it costs you a lot of money in surprise bandwidth. And just not having to worry about that, not having to worry about your success, particularly with machine learning models, where you could have customers sending hundreds of megabytes or even gigabytes worth of data to your model. And also having the ability and freedom to think in like a hybrid cloud premise by default. Being able to say, well, my data's in AWS, but it doesn't cost me any money to go get it. And it costs me money for AWS to let it out. Massively changes and really well complements the variety of deployment methods we have on the right-hand side. So actually, alongside these amazing different types of data storage and very simplified compute, one of the things we do differently is we're the only cloud provider that have parity between these 4 different environments. And obviously, the first one is public cloud. You can access that on Civo.com. The next one down is a private region on Civo.com. So that would be a single tenancy environment. You would have the entire region to yourself there. The level past that is actually you can look at having multiple regions and an entire Civo dashboard privately assigned to your company or you as an individual. And then most importantly, actually, is things like Civo on-premise, which has been able to actually install and run a full feature-rich public cloud inside your on-premise data center. And we've done some crazy experiments of being able to run those in things like swimming pools, return heat exchange back. And I think the ability for your developers to be able to work on a deployment and send it to the public cloud on-premise or a private region with the same code is fundamentally something that massively improves productivity and other cloud providers aren't thinking about.
And to be able to go sign up on a public cloud, kick the tires, decide you like it, and then run your own is a pretty unique experience.
And I think that's the future where we see cloud, is being able to have autonomy and mastery over where your workload runs. The data stays in your ownership, and then you being able to run high performance workloads doesn't penalize you for doing well with success with things like egress costs. But that's our infrastructure provisioning, and I think this is very much for people who want to build their own high performance machine learning and AI systems. And the most important part that Kunal is going to dig into is actually we have a number of turnkey open source GenAI solutions that will dramatically reduce the risk of setting up and running these types of infrastructure. So when you see the stats we talked about earlier around challenges around deploying to production, here is production-ready software with production-ready infrastructure that you can run really simple evaluations on. And hopefully Kunal shows you how easy that is. But just before he does, I think it would be great to just touch on our other product alongside this, which is, as Kendall mentioned, relaxAI, which is our entire privacy and security-focused large language model. We have a promise that we keep the sovereignty of this data within the region that it's running, and the quality of responses are comparable to things like ChatGPT. We are able to deploy this not only in the public cloud, but also on-premise and in private cloud, something that's not available with other alternatives like tools like ChatGPT. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is actually this is entirely in the OpenAI format. So if you've got an existing application that you've built with ChatGPT, you can change 2 lines of code and really simply gain dramatic improvements to your privacy, security, and compliance. But then also on top of that, be able to reduce the cost of your API. And we think that's a really compelling offering from the first point of call. But actually, as we continue to drive the Relax roadmap, we want to do things like offer custom open source models and models as a service, and start to build out more of the agentic functionality inside Relax alongside that. And if you're interested in using Relax either as a free user or a paid user, please feel free to sign up at relax.ai or reach out to the sales team at the very end of the call.